So I'll be talking about the cultural contribution of Aboriginal peoples and how they've changed the Canadian Army. 100 years ago, the First World War, you can tell when the Canadian forces were arriving, they reflected the dominant attitudes of society at the time, very British. Other groups, including Francophones, visible minorities, and women, were segregated or assimilated, if not completely banned. Today, Aboriginal peoples are welcomed and their cultural heritage appreciated and accepted. This article will present the perception of some veterans who adapted in various ways to the military culture, while also retaining elements of their own culture that helped significantly alter the Canadian forces. And my background is mainly made up of a series of about 60 interviews I did, 2001 to 2003, across the country, 60 in total, divided into 3 groups, 20 from each period, Second World War veterans in between 45 and 68, and then a later period. So in the First World War, this experience, it had a big impact, of course, but in various ways, helpful and harmful. There had been about 4,000 treaty Indians that signed up in the First World War, despite many obstacles. One of the most serious obstacles was Ottawa's policy not to accept Native volunteers on the grounds that, quote, Germans might refuse to extend to them the privileges of civilized warfare. But many had already enlisted, and many groups, the militia groups, they weren't even aware of that ban. So there were a lot that were accepted in. Once overseas, there were certain problems of adjusting to certain military practices. Most prominent, and the one that came up most often in everything before 1950, was the distinction between commissioned officers and other ranks. However, things that helped were familiarity with rifles and nature, especially survival skills. When the Second World War began in 1939, about 3,000 Aboriginal people living on reserves volunteered. This was impressive, but it was less than the number in the First World War. Ottawa's policies, particularly the decision to conscript status Indians, hampered recruitment. However, despite the obstacles, the number enrolling, considering their place in society, was still impressive. So of the 20 I interviewed for this period, the influence of community was a very common influence. Their family, particularly the father, those were important roles in their decision to join. Only 2 of the 20 said that they were victims of racism while they were in the Army. Most said that they were treated as equal, as we heard in some of the other speeches. One said that they were walking shoulder to shoulder and treated like brothers. Several noted what mattered most was that you did your job. Only 1 of the 14 considered that that type of equality extended into the civilian life when they returned. One example, Russell Modeste, he remembers being jailed when he returned because he was holding a liquor ticket. These were rationed in Canada and forbidden to Indians. He and other soldiers received the tickets when they were leaving their ship, and the magistrate, and this is a quote, "The magistrate told me that once you entered Canadian territorial waters, you were now just another Indian. You have no special privileges, and you have to abide by the law. You remember these things." Another veteran, Sam Sinclair, said that in the post-war period, when he returned, this is a quote, "Our people knew they were not receiving fair treatment, but they did not raise hell with protests or sit-ins like they have now." So in this period, what was very common and different is that the desire to be seen as equal was much stronger than the desire to have cultural distinctions recognized. Of these 20 veterans, some mentioned that the cultural distinctions that helped them the most included their familiarity with firearms and also, again, their ability to survive, the survival techniques that they had learned from their past. One interesting example, Lawrence Martin of Nipigon. When he was overseas, they were liberating Holland, and the family that was billeting him, they were very interested in his culture. And recently he returned with a native group to perform a pipe ceremony. Again, getting the support of the civilian populations was an important part of the Second World War, and this was a connection that he used to his advantage. So in the interwar periods, 46 to 67, the Korean War broke out, and the veterans who served in Korea, their experiences resembled very closely those of the Second World War. I won't go into details. One thing that came up with the other group was more and more people were mentioning how impressed they were with what the Canadian Forces did in the sense of helping people, community service. There was one who noticed them during the Winnipeg flood of 1950. And I quote, "It was very impressive to me the way they rescued people from the second-story windows. They were very inspirational, and I thought, you know, I love what they do." Making the world a safer and better place had been a consistent motivation for most recruits, but again, it was mentioned more often in this period, up until 45, up until 67. There was also more mention of discrimination. Some were noticing that they were treated as equal, and it was starting to hurt a bit more, or at least they were expressing it more than they had earlier. He was called the Indian, Joe John Sanapas of New Brunswick. He came from an isolated community, and he said it was disorientating when he was leaving his community. 5 minutes. There was unfamiliar bagpipe songs, and he said that he felt out of place. And then some of the white guys, they came and they talked to him, and they would listen to a group of Aboriginals, and they would take an interest in what they were saying, and then he fit right in. And these guys, and I quote, "They learned a great deal about natives." Again, also when there was techniques for survival, that was another place where they were much appreciated. So in the present, this is one of the ceremonies. Today they have Aboriginal days that are celebrated, and it's a big part of the Canadian Forces calendar. In June, they have these ceremonies. There's a monument for Aboriginal peoples in Ottawa. That's usually where it's held. Some of the other ways that they've integrated most recently include the ability to grow their hair longs. Earl Charters is one. I'll just give a quote from him. Dusty Boutiette's another one who's grown his hair. They've benefited from the recent Forces regulation permitting Aboriginal members to grow longer hair to communicate their cultural heritage. Quote, "Whenever there's something said against my hair, there are 5 other guys who speak in defense of my decision before I can say anything." Again, that's since about 2000 that they've had that option. So this group, it's a different type of focus, much more interest in training, education. Those are ways that their ability to integrate into the Canadian economy is helped. the programs that integrate the Aboriginal culture with the Canadian forces, they're incorporated with a lot of thought and a lot of consultation that goes into it. And there's a Defence Aboriginal Advisory Group that helps to set that stage with what's involved and what can be included and how to best do that. And they're also, of course, involved with some of the programs. General Paul mentioned the Bold Eagle program, the Raven and the Black Bear. Those are some of the summer programs. The second major types of programs include the Aboriginal leadership to become officers, and the third group, the 3-week program for a Native entry program. Again, there's more information at the back, and it'll be available in the longer text. This is an interesting one, a smudging ceremony. Again, it's not something you would have seen in the First World War. March 2016 at Petawawa. Notice the staff, Canadian Armed Forces Eagle staff. This is sometimes carried around. There's a staff carrier that's designated to be the porter. See him on the right, a Chief Warrant Officer in this case. Another program, Canadian Forces Artist Program, Artists from the North. This is a ranger who portrayed his time. Another one, Tim Pitzeluk, a very famous artist. Again, very different from the earlier ones. We'll hear more about the Rangers program. The final thing, there's a bit of a description of what's involved with the Eagle staff. And again, that's something that's interesting to read in detail, all the symbols involved with that. And look forward to hearing more about the Rangers now. Thank you.